Okay, I am reading and reviewing a few of the articles from this book, The Boston Consulting Group on Strategy. It is an absolute gem that I found through Richard Koch from who was interviewed on the Tim Ferriss podcast. And I'm sure this book's been out of print for a while, but like every article I read in it, even though they're often very old, they have a lot of great applications in today's business world. And you can, if you think about it after you read them, you can kind of compare them. So I want to go over this one article, the market share paradox. And this book's a series of articles written by Boston Consulting Group partners over the years about just general business strategy, things that they would share with their clients. This is Bruce Henderson, who was I think he was the founder and definitely one of the main partners in the group. And his a lot of what he wrote on was market share and the idea of working to drive down your costs so that you could gain more market share. And as you gain more market share, your costs would go down, you become more profitable, and market share, market share, market share. So this is kind of along the lines of that, and I think it's real interesting. And I'm going to read a lot of it, so bear with me, and then I'll make some comments. He says, market share is very valuable. It leads to lower relative costs and therefore higher profits. So here's the deal: if there's a market of $1 million of a market, say to make some kind of widget, and you're making 1%, $10,000 worth, well, you got to buy a factory, you got to pay rent, you got to hire executives, all of that. That's going to eat a lot of your revenue, and your margins are going to be really low. If you have 90% market share and you're making 900 grand in revenue, well, all those costs get spread out amongst a lot more revenue, and your costs are generally going to be lower, and you're going to be more profitable. So he says there are two principal reasons for a shift in market share between competitors. The most common is lack of capacity. The other reason is a willingness to lose share to maintain price. So lack of capacity first. Lack of capacity is a common occurrence. And when he says lack of capacity, this article, by the way, is written in 1970. Back then, the business world would have been a lot more in the thought process of factories. So that's where capacity is going to come from. A factory only has so much capacity. If you're making paper, trees come in, or tree pulp, or whatever they bring, they start within in a paper factory. But you have to have a certain number of machines to make a certain number of sheets of paper at the end. And if your market share is suddenly going from, hey, we're selling 1 million sheets a year to 2 million sheets a year, you'd have to double your capacity or double the amount of machines. You'd have to buy extra machines. You have to hire and train additional people, hire more managers, maybe add on capacity in terms of your building space, and there's going to be more rent or ownership costs. So that's what he kind of means by capacity in the sense of manufacturing. But think of this in today's terms, because we're a lot more nowadays, service oriented. Obviously, tech companies. Our economy is just different. So think of capacity in terms of your ability to grow, to meet more, to serve more customers. So we think, and if you look at, I don't know, but I bet 90% of business videos on YouTube are all about growing sales. And it's about how do you sell, how do you market, things like that. Well, that brings business in. But if you don't have the capacity to meet those customer needs and do a good job, there's no point. You're going to invest in salespeople, you're going to invest in marketing, Facebook ads, your social media. But if your operations are terrible, there's no point, because you're not going to get market share, because you're going to do a terrible job. So capacity, think of it as, there's three stools of business. There's operations, the stuff you actually do. There's sales and marketing, which is getting customers in the door. And then there's administrative functions, which is going to be your HR, your accounting, your finance, just all of the things that support your operations as well as your sales. So we think so much in terms of sales, but if your operations aren't there and you're not adding capacity, both in terms of people, hiring new employees and getting them trained up and having a good training program, if you're not adding capacity in terms of equipment you need to produce your whatever you're selling, your goods, your service, more locations, things like that. If your operational capacity isn't growing to meet market share, you can't grow. And so here's what Henderson's getting at in terms of the more you grow, the lower your costs. But part of that is you've got to continue to add capacity to grow effectively, especially as a market opens up. And nowadays, if you think about it, businesses constantly new markets opening up for companies. Amazon, they started with books, and then they move on to toiletries, and then they move on to videos, and then they move on to everything nowadays. Constant new markets opening up in cars. Now there's electric cars. Are GM, Ford, Chrysler, they can be able to enter into that market. Well, they've got to have new capacity to do that, right? They've got to be able to make those electric cars. They've got to have people who can sell them. They've got to have people who can service them. What's the capacity for recharging electric cars in the country, and how does that work? So there's all kinds of needs for growing capacity, and if you don't think about how are you going to grow your capacity, all the sales in the world doesn't matter because you can do a crap job and you're not going to gain market share. And if you don't gain market share, your costs aren't going to go down. And if your costs don't go down, your margins don't go up. But here's the next part that he mentioned. So that's great, right? Your market share goes up, your costs go down, your margins should be increasing. So if you used to make 10 cents for every dollar, if your net profit margin was 10%, meaning for every dollar you make, you take 10 cents home. If you gain more market share, maybe in a perfect world, you could increase that to 20% margins. You were making 10 cents, you're making 20 cents. Well, that's great, right? For every dollar you make, you're bringing more home to the bottom line. But here's the next thing that he says, and this is really interesting. The market share paradox is that if the low-cost firm, that's the firm that has gained market share and is getting those extra profit margins, if the low-cost firm would accept the high-cost producer's return on assets, the low-cost firm would preempt all market growth. So here's the thing is, you're humming along, you've increased capacity, you've increased sales, you're gaining market share, your profit margin's gone from 10% all the way to 20%, you're killing it. But that's only going to be temporary because the higher cost producer, so maybe there's someone who they haven't gained market share, they gained a little, their net profit margin is still 10% while yours is 20%. But they may be willing to cut down to 8 or 7% temporarily in order to gain market share because they see an opportunity. As they do that, their revenue goes up, their profit share margin may be even going down a little, but they're able to add capacity and cover costs better and start to become the low-cost producer and start to eat into your market share over time. And something he says that's interesting, the low-cost producer can take market share, but only if he is willing to sacrifice near-term profit. So if your profit margin is going up, if you're willing to sacrifice that, if that's 10 is trending towards 20, and you're willing to sacrifice and keep it at 10, you're going to gain a ton of market share because you can add capacity, you can enhance your operations, you could increase marketing. There's a lot of things that you could do. And this goes back to a general business principle is every business has an appropriate margin it should be earning. And a lot of businesses fool themselves into thinking that they are making a higher margin than they really are. A lot of business owners, especially small business owners, they may be making $100,000 a year, but in reality, the business's net profit is only 50. So they may be pulling out 100 and taking that home, but they're losing day by day because they're taking out too much. And that's kind of what he's getting at, but on a larger scale. If the low-cost producer who's figured out a way to drive down costs, if he would just maintain his or her net profit margin at 10% instead of allowing it to creep up to 20, they're going to gain more market share and they're going to preempt all growth from competitors. Since the low-cost firm typically has the highest market share, the high return expectations often lead him to sacrifice share in order to maintain near-term margins. Here's the thing. You get up to that 20, and now you've got a lot of market share, but now you're at 20% margin. And now you're thinking you need to maintain that margin. One of the things that's important to consider is, I always stress this in our business, when I'm talking to managers about how we're doing from a financial perspective, I want to make sure we're maintaining our net profit margins. If we're at a 10% and it goes down to a 9% and it goes down to an 8%, and it goes down to a 7% year over year, month over month, that could be indicative of a real problem, and we've got to figure out why that is and solve it. But the inverse could be true. If it's going from 10 to 11 to 12 to 13, and we aren't figuring out why that is, we could be losing. And there's a variety of reasons. Maybe we're not paying enough to hire the best staff. Maybe we're not hiring, or we're not marketing enough. Maybe we're not driving down costs the way we should. Maybe we're not investing in the future, investing in future operational strength. So you've got to be just as careful about rising margins as you do about shrinking margins. If your margins are rising and there's an explanation for that, and you're not sacrificing long-term growth in exchange for short-term extra cash, fine. That's great. But make sure you're doing that consciously, and that's part of your strategy, and you understand why that is, and that you're not short-sightedly hurting yourself down the road. He also says the trade-off is cumulative. More and more share must be given up over time to maintain price. Costs are a function of market share because of the experience effect. Lost market share leads to a loss of cost advantage. Ooh, there it is. So if you get these extra profits because you've got some extra market share and you've driven down costs, if you now try and maintain that profit margin, you're going to find you're going to lose market share. And then that's going to drive up your costs and reduce your margins. And then you're going to try and maintain those margins. And that's going to reduce your market share and drive up your costs even further. And that's going to drive down your margins, and so on and so forth. It's a vicious cycle. So when you see profit margins going up, you need to be asking yourself, is there some investing in operations and capacity that we need to make? He also goes into what's interesting is you also got to consider the industry you're in with this and how much growth there is in the industry. Without growth, it is virtually impossible to shift market share. No one can justify adding capacity. Neither can anyone afford to lose share at the price of idle capacity. Under such constraints, since prices will tend to be very stable, the appropriate strategy is to maximize profits within existing market shares. Some markets don't grow. There's a limited pool for certain industries. I'm not thinking of any off the top of my head, but I want to say encyclopedias, but that's a whole other story and a whole other article in here, which I'll review later. But say let's take a hot item like those spinner things my kids were using. They became hot all of a sudden and they went up, but at some point they would have leveled off because kids were moving on to another trend. Well, in that part, if you're the low cost producer and your profit margin has gone up, it doesn't make sense to drive down your cost and seek additional capacity to gain additional market share. There's no additional market share. So he says in a low growth industry, if that's your business, kind of what we've talked about before, it doesn't really apply. You just got to maximize your market share for as long as you can, and that's about it. Now, there's other places in this book where they talk about that's called a cash cow, where you're making a lot of money because you're the low cost producer and you got a lot of market share, but you better be taking a portion of that cash and investing in new products or new services or new lines of business, because that cash cow is not going to last forever. So that's something to think about. With only very little growth, the higher near-term profit now may be worth considerably more than continued modest profit. Those who hold share into the no-growth period are those with enough share and resulting cost position to anticipate satisfactory profits. So eventually, if there's just a little growth, it's eventually going to turn into no growth. And what we said in the preceding paragraph makes sense. Make it while you can if you're the low-cost producer. So if there's low growth, put yourself in a position to be the low-cost producer, but realize that at some point you got to recognize there's no growth. You've got to take the cash out of it and those profits out that you can, but make sure you're reinvesting in something else. With rapid growth, market share is both very valuable and very easy to lose. So this was the crux of the article. If it's a high growth industry and you find yourself getting more market share, your profit margin is going to go up, because remember, as your market share goes up, your costs should get driven down. But you've got to make sure that you're building capacity, you're increasing your marketing budget and sales budget, and making sure that you're looking to actively grow and gain market share. And this goes to the life cycle of companies, right? There's the growth stage, There's eventually the maturity stage. So in the high growth stage, you got to be gaining market share. That's why a lot of companies, you'll see this especially with tech companies, the focus the first few years is not on getting to be profitable. They'll have a negative profit margin because they're growing so fast. They're trying to gain revenue and they're trying to gain market share. Amazon, for years and years, that's what they did. They didn't turn a profit. Tesla, that's what they're doing now. They're trying to become by far the number one producer in the electric car world, because they know that Ford, GM, Chrysler, if they're successful, those guys are coming. So they've got to get that market share while they can drive down their costs, so that eventually, when electric cars becomes a large enough industry, they're the low-cost producer and they have the most market share. That's what they're doing now, and it's much more important than trying to turn a profit for them in the long run. On the other hand, growth means that capacity must be added rapidly. In advance of the growth, or market share will be lost automatically. To gain share, capacity addition must be based on preempting the growth component. So going back to the Tesla example, growth means that capacity must be added rapidly. Tesla's growing rapidly. Doesn't show on the net profit line, but on the revenue line, they are. They're getting a lot more customers converted into their model, wanting electric cars. They got to focus on growth in the form of revenue and not so much making a net profit at this point. If they were to sit there and say, because Tesla could tomorrow reorganize their business to turn a net profit on the revenue. I guarantee you they could. The problem is it'd be very temporary. So say they cut it and they were making a 10% margin, and I don't even know what they make. I don't have it off the tip of my head, but say that they were making $1 billion in net profit. That's great, but they wouldn't be reinvesting in R&D, plant capacity, design, marketing, their dealership network, etc., and they would lose in the long run. So right now they're focused on that top line revenue, and that's what their investors are looking for. That's why you see Tesla, even though they don't necessarily turn a profit, they still have a very, very high price for their stock, because people are betting that they're going to grow that market share and become the dominant player in the electric car industry. And that's why their share price is so high. Any So that's what they should be doing right now, because they're in that growth stage. They shouldn't be trying to turn a net profit at this point. So any shift in market share should be regarded as either an investment or disinvestment. The rate of return can and should be evaluated just as it would be in any other business situation. Change in market share should be an investment decision. So this is what's your ultimate rate of return. Any CFO like myself is ultimately an investment manager for the shareholders. And it's a question of, what is the market share that we should be trying to get? And if we're a growing market, we should be trying to gain market share. If we're a stable market, we should be trying to maintain market share and making sure that our cost structure is in line. Eventually, the electric car world, there's not going to be a ton more growth potential for Tesla. They're going to have to reshape and earn a decent profit margin, then in return actual cash to their shareholders. But just right now is not the time for that. They don't have. Not only, they probably have a great percentage of the market share of electric cars, but what are electric cars compared to gas cars? A fraction. Tesla's still got such a long way to go. And again, they know they have the Fords, they know they have the Chevys, the GMCs, all these startups like your Nikola. Now I'm blanking on the other ones. I just did a whole podcast about them. But there's all these kind of other new startup electric car companies that are going to be chasing Tesla. Fisker's one of them. Tesla's got to get the market share right now while they can, and it's an investment decision. Things that they would otherwise be able to distribute as profits, they're currently plowing in to gain market share, and that's actually absolutely what they should be doing. So, article written in 1970 has just as much application today if you change a few of the terms. So, again, great book. Make sure you get this one. Definitely every article I've read has some application to today's business world.